Good morning, and welcome back. Today I want to talk about a connection that has quietly become one of the most important findings in the entire field of aging and brain health, and yet it's a connection that most people have simply never heard explained clearly. It involves two things that, on the surface, don't seem related at all. Your hearing, and your risk of cognitive decline. I know that sounds like an unusual pairing. Your ears and your brain feel like two separate systems, one about sound, one about thinking and memory. But over the past decade and a half, a substantial body of research has built a genuinely compelling case that these two systems are far more connected than most people, and frankly, most doctors outside of specialized fields, ever really discuss. I want to walk you through this carefully today. Not to alarm you, and not to suggest that hearing loss guarantees cognitive decline, because it absolutely does not work that way. What I want to do is explain the real research behind this connection, why it exists, what the warning signs actually look like, and most importantly, what you can genuinely do about it, because this happens to be one of the more encouraging areas of aging research, precisely because hearing loss is something that can often be addressed. Why this connection surprised even the researchers who found it. Let's start with where this research actually came from, because I think understanding the origin helps explain why it's taken seriously in the medical community rather than being dismissed as speculation. Much of the foundational work in this area comes from research conducted at Johns Hopkins University, led by a researcher named Dr. Frank Lin, an otologist, meaning a physician who specializes in hearing, who became interested in a pattern he kept noticing in his own patients. Older adults with hearing loss seem to be developing memory and thinking problems at a higher rate than he would have expected, and this observation led to a series of larger, more rigorous studies looking at the relationship between hearing loss and cognitive decline over time. One of the most widely cited studies followed a large group of older adults over a period of years, tracking both their hearing ability and their cognitive function using standardized testing. What the researchers found was striking. Participants with hearing loss at the start of the study showed a notably faster rate of cognitive decline over the following years compared to participants with normal hearing, and the degree of decline tended to track with the severity of the hearing loss. Mild hearing loss was associated with a meaningfully increased risk. Moderate hearing loss was associated with a larger increase. Severe hearing loss was associated with the largest increase of all. This kind of dose-response relationship, where the effect gets stronger as the exposure gets stronger, is exactly the kind of pattern that makes researchers take a potential connection seriously, because it's harder to explain away as coincidence. This research has since been supported and expanded by other major studies and reviews. In fact, hearing loss in midlife was specifically identified as one of the modifiable risk factors for dementia in a major report published by the Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, Intervention, and Care, an international panel of experts who periodically review the global research on dementia risk. When a body of that caliber includes hearing loss as one of a relatively small number of factors that can genuinely be addressed to help reduce dementia risk at a population level, that's a meaningful signal about how seriously this connection is now taken within the medical and research community. Why would hearing loss affect the brain at all? The leading explanations. This is probably the question on your mind right now, and it's a fair one. Why would a problem with your ears have anything to do with your risk of cognitive decline? Researchers have proposed several explanations, and it's likely that more than one of them is contributing at the same time, rather than there being one single, simple cause. The first explanation involves something researchers call cognitive load. Here's how to think about it. When your hearing starts to decline, your brain has to work considerably harder to process the sounds it's still receiving, filling in gaps, straining to understand speech, particularly in noisy environments like restaurants or family gatherings. This extra effort draws on cognitive resources, attention, and working memory, that would otherwise be available for other mental tasks. Over years, this constant, low-grade strain on your brain's resources may contribute to a kind of accelerated cognitive fatigue or decline, essentially because your brain is being asked to spend more of its energy simply trying to hear, leaving less available for other cognitive functions. The second explanation involves brain structure itself. Hearing involves a genuinely complex process, where sound is detected by the ear and then processed extensively by the brain, in regions responsible not just for hearing itself, but for language processing and memory. Some research using brain imaging has found that people with untreated hearing loss show a faster rate of shrinkage in certain areas of the brain, including regions involved in memory and thinking, compared to people with normal hearing. The leading theory is that when the brain receives less auditory input over an extended period, the areas responsible for processing that input, along with connected areas involved in memory and language, may not receive the same level of stimulation and use, and areas of the brain that go underused over long periods can be more vulnerable to atrophy, similar to how muscles that go unused can weaken over time. The third explanation involves social isolation, and I want to spend a bit of extra time on this one, because I think it's the most underappreciated part of this entire topic. Hearing loss, especially when it's untreated, makes conversation genuinely exhausting and frustrating, both for the person with hearing loss and for the people around them. Group conversations become difficult to follow. Phone calls become a source of anxiety rather than connection. Restaurants and social gatherings, which rely heavily on picking out speech from background noise, become draining rather than enjoyable. Over time, this often leads people to gradually withdraw from social situations, not because they don't want connection, but because the effort required to participate has become genuinely exhausting. And here's the part that connects directly back to cognitive health. Social isolation and loneliness are, independently, well-documented risk factors for cognitive decline in older adults. Regular social interaction appears to provide a kind of ongoing cognitive stimulation, conversation, following multiple threads of discussion, responding in real time, that engages the brain in ways that are difficult to replicate through other activities. If hearing loss is quietly pushing someone toward social withdrawal, year after year, that withdrawal itself may be contributing to cognitive decline as a separate, additional pathway, layered on top of the cognitive load and brain structure factors we just discussed. Why this specific warning sign gets dismissed so often? I want to talk honestly about why hearing loss, despite this research, so often goes unaddressed in older adults, sometimes for years, or even decades, after it first becomes noticeable. Part of it is genuinely gradual onset. Age-related hearing loss, known medically as presbycusis, typically develops slowly, over years, rather than appearing suddenly. Because the change happens gradually, the brain adapts along the way, and people often don't fully recognize how much their hearing has actually declined, since there was never a single dramatic moment where the change became obvious. It's common for hearing loss to be noticed first, and more clearly, by family members, a spouse who's tired of repeating themselves, an adult child who notices the television volume creeping progressively higher over the years, rather than by the person experiencing it themselves. There's also a real stigma attached to hearing aids specifically, one that doesn't exist nearly as strongly around other common aging-related devices, like reading glasses. Hearing aids have historically been associated, fairly or not, with visible signs of aging and frailty, and a lot of people delay seeking treatment for years because of how they imagine they'll be perceived by others, even when the hearing loss itself is already noticeably affecting their daily life and their relationships. And there's a more practical barrier as well. Historically, hearing aids have been expensive, and in many cases weren't covered by standard health insurance, which created a genuine financial obstacle for a lot of people, on top of the emotional and social hesitation. It's worth noting that this has been shifting in recent years, with over-the-counter hearing aids becoming available in the United States without requiring a prescription or an audiologist visit for people with perceived mild to moderate hearing loss, which has made addressing hearing loss considerably more accessible and affordable than it used to be. The combination of all of these factors, gradual onset that's hard to notice in yourself, social stigma, and historical cost barriers, means that a huge number of people live with untreated hearing loss for years longer than they need to, often dismissing the early signs as simply an inevitable part of getting older, rather than recognizing it as something that's both common and, importantly, something that can be addressed. The specific early warning signs worth paying attention to. So let's get concrete. What does early hearing loss actually look like in daily life, before it becomes obvious enough that it can no longer be ignored? One of the earliest and most common signs is difficulty following conversation, specifically in noisy environments, restaurants, family gatherings, crowded rooms, even though hearing seems mostly fine in quiet, one-on-one settings. This is actually a very typical early pattern, because background noise makes the job of separating speech from other sound considerably harder, and it's often the first situation where early hearing loss becomes apparent, well before it affects quieter, simpler listening situations. Another common early sign is frequently asking people to repeat themselves. Or noticing that you're relying more heavily on lip reading or watching someone's face closely to help fill in what you're not quite catching through hearing alone, often without consciously realizing you've started doing this. A particularly telling sign, and one that's frequently reported by family members rather than the person themselves, is a gradual increase in television or radio volume over months and years, to a level that other people in the household find uncomfortably loud, while it feels completely normal to the person adjusting it. Difficulty hearing higher-pitched sounds specifically is another common early pattern. Things like a doorbell, a phone ringing, birds chirping outside, or higher-pitched voices, often women's and children's voices in particular, being harder to make out clearly than lower-pitched sounds, since age-related hearing loss frequently affects higher frequencies first and most significantly. And finally, a pattern that connects directly back to what we discussed earlier about social withdrawal, a growing tendency to avoid group social situations, phone calls, or gatherings specifically because they've become tiring or frustrating, even if the person hasn't consciously connected that avoidance to their hearing. If you're noticing several of these patterns in yourself, or if a family member has gently mentioned noticing them in you, that's genuinely worth treating as a signal to get your hearing properly tested, rather than something to wave away as a normal, unavoidable part of aging that doesn't warrant attention. What a hearing evaluation actually looks like. I think part of the hesitation people feel around this topic comes from not knowing what a hearing evaluation actually involves, so let me walk through it briefly, because it's considerably simpler and less intimidating than people often expect. A standard hearing evaluation, typically done by an audiologist, involves sitting in a quiet, sound-treated room and listening for a series of tones at different pitches and volumes through headphones, indicating when you can hear each one. There's usually also a speech recognition component, where you're asked to repeat words or short phrases at varying volumes, sometimes with background noise added, to assess how well you're able to understand speech specifically, not just detect that a sound occurred. The entire process typically takes well under an hour, it's completely painless, and at the end, you receive a clear, detailed picture of your hearing across different frequencies, which becomes the basis for a specific recommendation, whether that's simply monitoring things over time, or exploring hearing aid options suited to your specific pattern of hearing loss. The genuinely encouraging part of this research. Here's what I think is the most important part of today's video, and the reason I wanted to cover this topic in the first place. Because hearing loss is a modifiable, treatable condition in the vast majority of cases, this connection between hearing and cognitive health represents one of the more hopeful, actionable areas in the entire field of dementia prevention research. There's been growing research interest specifically in whether treating hearing loss, primarily through hearing aids, can help reduce the rate of cognitive decline associated with untreated hearing loss. One of the more significant recent studies in this area, a large randomized trial known as the ACHIEVE study, examined this question directly in older adults, and found that hearing intervention, meaning hearing aids and related support, was associated with a meaningfully slower rate of cognitive decline over several years, specifically among participants who were considered at higher risk for cognitive decline going into the study. This is a genuinely important finding, because it moves the conversation from simply observing an association between hearing loss and cognitive decline, toward real evidence that addressing hearing loss may actually help protect cognitive function over time, at least in higher-risk populations. I want to be careful and accurate here, because this is still an active area of ongoing research, and it would be an overstatement to say that hearing aids have been definitively proven to prevent dementia in every person who uses them. But the direction of the evidence is genuinely encouraging, and combined with everything else we've discussed today, the cognitive load involved in straining to hear, the potential effects on brain structure from reduced auditory stimulation, and the very real risk of social withdrawal and isolation, addressing hearing loss represents a meaningful, evidence-supported step that's well within most people's control. Unlike many other risk factors for cognitive decline that are far harder to influence. What to actually do with this information? So let's make this practical. If you've been putting off a hearing test, whether out of stigma, cost concerns, or simply because the change has been gradual enough that it never felt urgent, I'd genuinely encourage you to treat today's video as a nudge to schedule one. Many audiologists offer hearing evaluations at low or no cost, specifically because they know that early identification leads to much better outcomes than waiting until hearing loss becomes severe. If cost has been a barrier in the past, it's worth looking into over-the-counter hearing aid options, which have become considerably more affordable and accessible in recent years, alongside traditional audiologist-fitted devices, which remain the right choice for more significant or complex hearing loss. If you're watching this because you've noticed some of these signs in a spouse or a parent rather than in yourself, I'd encourage a similar approach to the one we discussed in an earlier video about memory changes. Frame the conversation around care rather than criticism. Something like, "I've noticed you've been having a harder time in group conversations lately, and I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to support you. Would you be open to getting your hearing checked?" Tends to land far better than pointing out frustration over having to repeat yourself, even if that frustration is genuinely understandable and real. And if you already wear hearing aids, this research offers a bit of encouraging validation for a decision you've already made, along with a good reason to make sure they're being used consistently, rather than sitting in a drawer because they feel like a hassle, since the cognitive benefits appear to be tied to consistent use over time, not just ownership of the device itself. Bringing this together. So let's step back and look at the full picture we've covered today. Hearing loss and cognitive decline are connected through several plausible, well-researched pathways: the cognitive strain of constantly working to process degraded sound, potential effects on brain structure from reduced auditory stimulation over time, and the very real risk of social withdrawal and isolation that often follows untreated hearing loss. This connection has been identified consistently across multiple large studies, and hearing loss has been specifically flagged by major international dementia research bodies as one of the modifiable risk factors worth addressing. And encouragingly, more recent research suggests that treating hearing loss may actually help slow cognitive decline in higher-risk individuals, which means this is genuinely something within your control, not simply a risk factor to worry about without any real recourse. The single most useful thing you can take from today's video is this: if it's been more than a couple of years since your hearing was properly tested, or if you've noticed any of the early warning signs we discussed today, treat that as worth acting on, not something to quietly dismiss as an unavoidable part of getting older. A hearing test is simple, painless, and increasingly affordable, and based on everything the research now shows, it may be doing considerably more for your long-term brain health than most people ever realize. If today's video gave you something worth acting on, whether for yourself or for someone you love, I'd genuinely appreciate you sharing it with them. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. We publish new, carefully researched videos every week, built to help you understand the real, evidence-based connections behind healthy aging, without unnecessary fear, and with real, actionable steps you can actually take. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take care of your hearing, take care of your mind, and I'll see you in the next one.